Do you struggle to find answers to your pelvic health problems? Do you feel silenced in your quest to just feel better? Women, girls, sisters, if you have experienced infertility, PCOS, incontinence, painful periods, sexual trauma, and so much more associated with the pelvis, then Women's Pelvis Wellness is a place for you. Me and experts from around the world are joining here to get you the answers to the holistic health that you have been seeking. Please join us in being a pelvis wellness warrior. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome my special guest, Kelly Noel, here today, and she is going to share with us her expertise about conscious kink and BDSM. I met Kelly through a networking group that we are part of, or I am part of. I'm not sure if you joined, but it was really interesting because when I heard kink and BDSM, I immediately felt that like feeling in your gut where you are completely not comfortable with this conversation or this topic. So I have really been focusing very much on diving into my own triggers and releasing them so that they don't control me. And I thought, okay, this makes me uncomfortable. I need to talk to her. I need to learn more about this because I know that it's not what it has been portrayed to be and this picture that I have in my mind. So I'm excited to have you here today. So thank you so much for coming.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Yeah. I'm glad to be here and just really grateful. And, I think this, talking about conscious kink is so important because when a lot of people think of BDSM, they think of 50 Shades of Grey. They think of, there's often a lot of misconceptions or misunderstanding of what does this include? What does this entail? And yeah, I mean, it's so about consent, and it's so about when we're doing it consciously. And I think that's some of the messages that people miss or they don't see. Right. Is a lot of what we see in the media around kink or around BDSM, like it's not exactly how people do it in real life.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I would imagine that there would be a lot of boundaries. So if there's respect
Mm-hmm.
and there's boundaries and you're conscious, that means that you've done the work, the self-love, the worthiness. There's really actually a lot of energy work and beauty that is required for this, not to mention, the wonderful gift of being able to be vulnerable, because that I know right off the bat that's my problem. Like, you think I'm going to give up full control? I don't think so. No, well, I don't think so.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you could always elect to be the domain or the dominant, and then, you'd be the one in control. So that's always a choice.
Right.
Yeah.
But I definitely feel, though, as if that's something, that vulnerability issue is definitely something that I have to work on, which is why, again, like, ooh, this makes me uncomfortable. I need to dive in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely vulnerability that's required with kink and BDSM. And I guess before we get any further, it's probably good for me to start
explain
with a
what they are.
Definition. Yeah, explain it, because first of all, not everybody's heard of 50 Shades of Grey. And second of all, 50 Shades of Grey is not representative of what's all out there, and is, I just use that because I think it's an example that's
pretty
so,
sure.
Yeah, it's pretty mainstream. The films and the books both did well,
for sure,
and told well. So it's often what people are most familiar with when they hear BDSM. They're like, oh, 50 Shades. Yeah, that's one example. So when we're thinking about sexuality, a lot of what's considered okay, and I use air quotes here, okay with sex, comes from religion. There's a lot of repression that took place around sexuality.
Definitely.
Well, I mean, and there's a couple pieces to that, right? One is that women and female-bodied individuals were treated as chattel. They were treated as property for centuries, potentially,
Right.
arguably millennia. And so,
Like the 10 cow wife. Did you ever hear that story of the 10 cow wife?
I know I have not.
Well, I mean, think of the punchline. That's exactly like she was worth 10 cows.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it's just whatever. I digress. Sorry.
No, that's exactly it. And so I grew up Catholic. I mean, that's where my story
Me too.
started.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of messaging that I came in contact with when I was growing up in the church, that sex was between a man and a woman who were married. And so, being someone who
And you didn't
later,
enjoy it. You
yeah,
can't
and you
enjoy
didn't
it. You
enjoy
can't
it.
talk about it.
We can't talk about it.
It's very dirty.
We never do it in public.
No, save it for the one that you love, because it's the
Save,
dirtiest act you could do.
well, specifically save it for marriage, and
Yeah.
I have to admit, I've, had a couple people suggest I read Theology on the Body, and I haven't done that. I'm curious if that would shift my perspective at all. But so I can't speak for, like, all Catholics. Like, there
For
may be
sure.
some Catholics who grow up in a different environment where, as long as it's in marriage, that they feel free to explore. The messaging I came into contact with, the beliefs that I had and was exposed to and that I internalized, was, it's, wait till marriage, which is, common position in the church, between a man and a woman, and presumably, like, missionary. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't, and right, I mean, I didn't learn about some of them. I mean, and missionary is plenty fine. Like, I mean, I like missionary,
Sure,
but
yeah.
there's so much more out there, and there's so much more that can be incorporated into, and I even like to expand it beyond calling it sex. I call it erotic play when I'm talking about it, because for some people, especially when we're talking about kink and BDSM, sex isn't involved. There are many times where, for me, sex is not involved, period. Like, I'm not sexually connecting with my partner. And it still activates a lot of the same body areas, because a lot of that trust, a lot of that vulnerability, a lot of that intimacy is still required.
Sure.
So when we're talking about kink, it is erotic play, so that can include sexual play, that, according to, like, the church, or like these religious structures, or
And kind of mainstream culture.
like
I would say,
mainstream
even.
culture, our mainstream culture says it's missionary, lights off, like, right?
Yeah.
That's it. That's all that's allowed. So kink really is expanding beyond that, and
Hey,
it
Kelly Noel.
includes, yeah. So kink is really anything that's non-standard according to that definition. So it includes fetishes. It includes, I mean, it's a pretty wide umbrella. And it includes BDSM as part of that. It also includes voyeurism, which means, being turned on by watching people have sex or engage in erotic play, and exhibitionism, which is being turned on, receiving pleasure from engaging in acts that other people see.
Sure.
So kink is a pretty wide umbrella. And then BDSM, it's 3 different acronyms. So you've got the B and the D, which is bondage and discipline. So when we think of bondage, a couple common examples are handcuffs and blindfolds.
Sure.
Discipline, I mean, punishment is sometimes given, and it can be, you know, really a turn on
Sure.
to be instructed, to be disciplined. And then that middle acronym is the dominance and submission, which I think most people are somewhat familiar with if they've done any reading on this topic. But you know, dominance being I am directing the scene, I am guiding the scene, I am giving orders. And submission meaning I am surrendering to the experience, I am often following orders. And then that last acronym is sadism and masochism, or S&M. Sadism is receiving pleasure from causing physical, emotional, psychological pain. All of this is consensual. All this is consensual, by the way. Like when we're talking about conscious kink, consent is so critical, so important. And I like to bring that up when I'm talking about sadism, because I think that can be a word that people are like, oh my God, like that's kind of scary. And like, you know, so I just
and it's
like
not
to reiterate.
as if like you don't have to do this, people. You don't have to do these kinds of things. We're sharing everything, you know, that's, and whatever you and your partner decide is right is what's right. So
exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
we're just informing about all of it. And again, you know, I don't know a lot about it, so I'm excited.
Great. And then masochism is that other piece. That's the M in S&M. And masochism is receiving pleasure from, or being turned on from, receiving pain. So whether that's physical, emotional, psychological, and that varies for, you know, for everybody.
Sure.
And then one thing I'll just say is that I think when people hear about kink, they hear about BDSM, they, you know, think about like the dungeon, they think about
whips and
you know,
chains and
right, really intense stuff. And it doesn't have to be that. I mean, you know, I give the example of sadism can be, I'm scratching my partner because I like using my fingernails on their skin, and I like how they kind of wince and kind of shift. That's sadism. That's just a very mild form of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or like, you know, getting your hair pulled.
Yes.
You know,
same
being
thing.
spanked.
Yes. Same thing.
Yeah.
Yes. And
well, what do you know? Look at all the stuff I already know.
you're right. Yeah. So the really cool thing is that, I guess this kind of goes into my story. So like I said, I grew up Catholic, and so I had no idea that this was out there. I was so shut down sexually. When I was in high school, I was wearing a purity ring. I was going to Catholic rallies.
Oh, me too. Yep.
I was like, I didn't know what masturbation was. Anytime I had a thought about sex, especially if it was sex with a woman, it was like, I'm a bad person. Like these are lustful thoughts, total shame around sex, and disconnected from my body, disconnected from my creativity in certain ways, disconnected from my sexuality. Yeah. And then I left the church in 2012. I came out as being bisexual, and then later I've come out as being queer and transgender. So I use they, them pronouns. And
so just explain to some people, if you don't mind, because again, this is for education.
Sure.
What is the difference between, well, you said bi. I mean, I understand what bi is. What is what's queer and gay?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people have heard of the acronym LGBTQ.
Sure.
Or LGBTQ plus. It's usually, so L is for lesbian, G is for gay, B is for bisexual, T is for transgender, and Q is for queer and questioning. Queer is a catch-all. Queer used to be, and for older generations, it sometimes is still a word that can be offensive. It was a slur,
Sure.
saying, because queer means odd. That's where it came from.
Right.
And
it's quite a broad, you're odd. Well,
the thing is, though, that younger generations, so millennials are a great example, are reclaiming that term because there's a lot of healing power in that. And so in academia, it's actually referred to as queer theory instead of gay theory, because gay just refers to people who typically are explicitly and only attracted to people of another gender. So like we think of, one example might be a gay man who experiences no attraction for women and no attraction for gender non-conforming folks. So queer is that catch-all. And so I identify as queer. And then as far as transgender, it just means that I don't identify with the sex that I was assigned at birth. So I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as being a non-binary person. I identify as being neither exclusively male nor female, man nor woman. I'm in the middle. So even though looking at me, people would say, "Oh, she's a woman," I that's not how I see myself.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I use they pronouns because that feels more authentic to me. And I, it just, and it's something that I've been my whole life. It's just that much like the bisexuality piece where I was judging myself and I felt like this isn't okay. And it just wasn't something that we had language for, 15 years ago.
Well, and people were not talking about it.
Right. They were not talking about it. Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And not even that it was wrong. It's just that it was so different from what people knew and understood. And, and there's been a lot of boxes that people have been put into with gender and sexuality. And this is just, another example. And so for me, coming out as being non-binary, coming out as being transgender has been really, it's been an interesting experience. It's also been really healing because it gives me the freedom to say, this is how I want to be, and this is how I identify, and this is me. Like I said, though, it's something that has always been part of my experience. Cause I remember when I was like 10 or 11, I told my dad, I said, I feel like in my brain, there's a male part and there's a female part. Like there's a part of my brain that is male. And I verbalized that to him as I was still in elementary school. And so then as I was identifying as gender fluid and, then non-binary, I came back to that and I realized like, I've always been this way. It's just that I wasn't out about it and I didn't know it was something to be out about.
Right.
I just,
right.
Yeah. But
now we have all these terms too.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just been, so for me, that's been incredibly healing. And that was something that I don't think I would have explored, and I don't think I would have come out while I was still Catholic, because I mean, that was so pushed down. Like I identified as being an ally, like an LGBTQ ally. I was like, nope, I'm not part of the community. I just have friends who are. And then a couple of years later, I'm like, oh wait, I think I might be bisexual.
Yeah.
So leaving the church was like really crucial for me to reclaim my authentic self and to love myself and to explore sex and sexuality and
Yeah.
gender. Yeah.
Well, and thank you so much for being so open and sharing your story about all of that. It's because I just don't think that everybody, including myself, understands what all of that stuff means. So it's good to learn about new things. And yeah, you can definitely see how that fluidly translates into, you know, what you do with conscious kink and BDSM. And I was talking to Kelly Noel before we started recording, and I said, doing this type of erotic play really almost commands a lot of inner self-work, because you have to be confident and you have to love yourself and, you know that you're worthy, and be able to be strong enough to be vulnerable, because I think that that is, for me, I mean, obviously something that really sticks out for me, because obviously that's what I have to work on. So it's just, it really is, you know, could be a wonderful part of a healing journey. But again, you don't have to do any of it. Just talk to your partner. That's the biggest thing. I always find it so interesting that we can't talk about doing the acts, but we can do the acts.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep. And that's something that, as I started exploring kink myself, that I did a lot of. I was like, I want to do this thing, but I don't know how to talk about it because I never learned how to talk about it. And so I, you know, didn't listen to my body, and I ignored my boundaries, and I set myself in, I put myself in situations that, like if my mother were to know about them, she'd be like, you did what?
Right.
So don't anyone tell her.
Right.
But you know, and I learned through practice, and really where I learned the most was when I started going to public events, because that's where there's a lot of structure, and they talk openly and explicitly about consent, and there's so much structure, and everyone, like, I agree to follow certain rules to be in this space. And so I learn, oh, these are the things that I can bring back into playing with my partner, or just playing by myself, or just engaging with others. So I learned so much more about boundaries and consent and accepting my body and loving myself through kink and being part of the kink community than, really prior. And I'd been doing spiritual work for, I want to say, like, because I started doing Reiki at the end of 2016, and I started going to Kink Events at the beginning of 2018. So I'd been doing Reiki for a solid year, and had been doing healing around sex, since like 2014. And, and so yet in the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years now, I've healed so much more, because I've had these tools that just allowed me to feel safe and explore things that I never would have.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so strange, because I feel like we get so many mixed signals in just general media and, whatever. It's like we should have awesome bodies, but we shouldn't enjoy them. And, we should be, I don't know, there's just all of these specific ways that we should be, but we shouldn't like ourselves. We shouldn't enjoy it, but we should make sure that the partner enjoys it. It just seems so strange. And I think that I even said this to you the very first time that we talked, that like the two things that ruin sex is religion and porn. Because they're both like, they're both in a way like lies and fake, so we have these pictures in our mind of what it's supposed to look like, or talking to our friends, and what really it boils down to is, you and your partner have to have an open conversation.
Yeah.
Because you are the only two who are going to be able to decide what's right for you, and none of that has to be explained to anyone else.
Yeah, I think your point is definitely true in a lot of cases. You know, I think there's a lot of religions, you know, Catholicism among them, where communicating openly about sex is just not demonstrated, and so the message that people get is like, can't talk about sex. And then in a lot of mainstream porn, we see open consent violations where, you know, it's not consensual. People aren't talking about sex. So we don't see them saying, hey, this is what I want to try. This is
Right.
why I want to try it. Like, are you game for that? Is that a hell yes for you? We don't
Right.
see that in mainstream porn. There are, you know, ethical kinds of porn that where that's illustrated. And I think those can
Sure.
be empowering for certain folks. I think mainstream porn by and large, though, does have a deleterious effect on people's sex lives. And
Sure.
it can really affect a lot of relationships for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's just a conversation that, you know, people need to have more of, you know, because um, it's like you say, it's just not a conversation that we have when it comes to, you know, certainly women, but just really everybody. So it's interesting because obviously even in, you know, families where they do talk openly about sex, they certainly don't use the terms kink and BDSM. You know, they
Nope.
certainly are not going to
Nope.
talk about that to their 14 and 16-year-old kids when they're, you know, teaching them how to be safe. So.
Yeah. Yeah. In most families, absolutely not. You know, I do have a contact in my life, and I thought this was wonderful. They have a child that just came of age, and um, like, my impression is they're speaking openly about these things, but that, you know, and that person's also part of the community, though. They already practice kink and BDSM. So for them, like, talking about it is, you know, it's different than like most people, because
Sure.
there's like this, like, well, is that okay for me to talk about? How do I talk about this? Like, or they're not even doing it. And how can I speak to something and educate my kid on something if it's not something I've explored or I've done?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I think, you know, consent is so important. I think that's the piece that is really missing in a lot of the conversations. And, you know, it's something that I remember hearing, I think for the first time really on my college campus freshman year. And even then, I still really didn't understand what it meant. And I didn't understand that it meant listening to my body and all parts of my body and all
Sure.
parts of me to make sure that I was a yes, and creating that space for the other person without coercion, without pressure, without asking multiple times, hoping for a different answer.
Right.
You
Yes.
know, we don't talk about those nuances with consent in
And then
everyday
sometimes you
life.
just do it so they'll leave you alone.
Right, exactly. And that's a consent violation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, yeah, and
Well,
so that's, yeah.
yeah, and I was also just going to say, you know, when you come from a background of, you know, possible, you know, molestation, sexual
Yep.
assault, rape of
Yep.
some sort, you know, any of those instances, that is obviously a complete violation of you, you know,
Mhm.
physically, emotionally, energetically, all of the things. So to do the healing, you know, in your pelvic region, in those first three chakras, really sending a lot of love
Mhm.
into that area is so, so important. And
Mhm.
again, it's not that you ever have to do any of these things, but to be able to have the conversation and to think about it without feeling any judgment or shame or anything around it is so healthy, you know?
Mhm. Yeah. And one thing, just to dovetail off that, Amy, is that, you know, when I work with clients who have really deep trauma, like the incest, the rape, the molestation, sometimes even religious trauma can be really intense. Like when we're talking about purity culture and, people who grew up in fundamentalist, churches or whatnot. Kink is not where we start, because
for sure.
it can be frightening, and it's not where we start. We start with coaching, we start with talking about it, and we start with bringing them back to the body, which is very similar to the work that you do.
Right.
Especially, with the Reiki infusion. I mean, it's about bringing people into their bodies. And if they're not there, then they're not going to know what their body is telling them. And so then when it comes to kink, they might have challenges doing it consciously because they're not clear if their body is saying yes or no, or if their body is saying no, they might not listen.
Right. Yeah. As you were talking, I just had this thought that, oh my gosh, I just sound so Wisconsin right there. I find it so crazy that in these, the religious sects that kind of believe in the whole no sex till marriage thing, which are a lot of them, they tell us not to, that it's a sin, that it's bad, but they don't give us the tools to not do it.
Right.
They give you no tools. So what do you expect? And then you go out and you do something and hopefully you enjoy it. Maybe you didn't, but either way you feel like shit and you are so ashamed. It's like, if you want that of your child, and it can be done, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, but give them the tools to at least, if that's their goal, help them along, and then be respectful if they change, if they don't want what you want.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a big part of the issue, and that like, not just kink. I think that's a big part of the issue when it comes to really accepting LGBTQ kids as well. Yeah. I mean, queer kids, queer teens, they're kicked out of their homes at a much higher rate. I don't have statistics right in front of me. But I mean, it's really saddening. And a lot of that comes from religious bias, that it's according to the Bible, according to the church, it's not okay to be gay. It's not okay to be bisexual. It's not okay to be transgender. And so they're kicked out of their homes. And I think that goes back to what you're saying of, like, even if they're wanting something different, like, just let them live, just let them be. Just if it's not, as long as it's consensual, as long, if it's like erotic play, and they're making their decisions from an informed, clear-headed space, then, I'd like to see a world where we can just let each other be and let each other live.
Right. No, I agree. Because again, it's between you and your partner. It's not between anyone else. You're not affecting anyone else. Mm-hmm. That's what I used to always tell, some friends and family. My life choices are not going to affect your salvation. So just step off and don't worry so dang much. Like, you're good. You're going right to the pearly gates. You're fine. Don't worry so much about me.
Yeah, I like that. My life choices will not affect your salvation.
Yeah.
That's so good. So good. I love it.
Well, you can use it. You're welcome.
I will attribute it to Amy Lee.
Thank you. Yeah, because it's just, I don't know why they just, like, we should all just focus more inward, more on us. Because again, it's not just about salvation, it's about anything in life. Mm-hmm. Your neighbor's grass, if they decide not to cut it, that's not going to affect your lawn. You don't have to under the skin.
Right.
It's stupid.
Yeah. And
You know, just little things like that, you know, I mean.
Yeah. And that, that I mean, and that's why self-work is so important. That's why healing is so important, because it's when I do that healing work that I let go of that judgment and I realize, oh, this doesn't affect me. I can just kind of let it be. It's not my problem. It's not my problem. And I think we're starting to see more of that around sex and sexuality and gender expression and gender identity. And, I think that's going to keep continuing. I think that, we've seen a lot of people working on themselves, a lot of people really ascending with their consciousness. And I think that's just going to keep continuing as we advance as a culture. And I'm really grateful about that, really excited about that, because I think having shame and guilt around sex is one of the things that contributes to a lot of the, behaviors that we see that don't work.
Well, this has been a super interesting conversation. I really appreciate your time. Are there any last things that you'd like to say before you tell everybody how to contact you and how they can find you?
Just that consent is so important. And if you are having conversations with your partners, or even if you're exploring with yourself, to just make sure that all parts of you are on board, that it's a full-bodied, enthusiastic yes. And because I think that's a piece that is often missing from the conversation. So just when you're talking about, like, I want to explore this, or you're engaging in solo play and it's like, I'm going to do this, like, do all parts of you want to do that? If not, then maybe do something else.
Right. Be present in your body. I think a lot of times we're not in our bodies when we're doing those acts. Yeah. So wonderful. So how can everyone find you and get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you can find me on my website. That's the erotic empowerment website. That's empowered, EMPOWERED, erotic, EROTIC.com. You can also join our free Facebook group. That's the Sexy Spiritual Badasses. So yeah, I don't know how I came across that topic or that title, that name, but it just stuck and I really love it. You can also find, those are the two main ways. And so if you're wanting to connect via email, you can reach out to our team at hello, that's HELLO at empowerederotic.com. And like I said, the website, the Facebook group, those are the biggest ways to find us. I'm planning to post more on Instagram eventually. And my handle there is Empowered Erotic as well. Nice.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure being on. Thank you for having me, Amy.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining me today on Women's Pelvis Wellness, where you can be heard. Because remember, if you're not being heard, you're not being helped. Please join my Facebook group by the same name, Women's Pelvis Wellness, and join a community of women who are there for you to support you, guide you, and love you through your pelvic health struggles. Also, this is a great place to check out my new class schedule. Thank you for joining me and becoming a pelvis wellness warrior.